I was preaching in the Orange Bowl to the Baptist World Alliance. I sat beside the great defensive end of the Cleveland Browns, who are this year the great world champions. I sat beside Bill Glass. For the last 3 years, he's played in the Pro Bowl, which is the all-star of pro football. And for 3 years, he played for Baylor University and was All-American. And he's one of the greatest football players in America today. And I want Bill Glass to come and tell us what Christ means to him.
You just can't have a better introduction to Bill Glass than one by Billy Graham. I first became acquainted with Bill about 10 years ago when I started doing volunteer work with his prison ministry. And the story of me asking to interview him is also part of episode 1 of Kim's Corner. Bill still serves on the board of directors of Behind the Walls Prison Ministries that he founded in 1972. He's also active in the ministry's development and is their inspirational leader. He even goes to the prisons to share the gospel whenever he can. We met with him in his home in Waxahachie, and at 85 years young, Bill Glass is still going strong, despite going through the most painful time of his life only a few years ago.
Well, when I was in high school, I became very enamored of sports.
So your brother went to Rice, and you ended up going to Baylor. You had a full scholarship.
That's right, and got recognition as a high school football player.
But I think probably, would you say that your greatest achievement in college was meeting and marrying Mavis?
By far. She was the most beautiful girl at Baylor. Everybody agreed that she was gorgeous, and the freshman players on the team always said, you know, they wanted to date her, but she wouldn't date them because she was in love with me, and I was just a picture pasted to her mirror in her room.
That's so sweet. So what was the first time that you saw her, the first time your eyes met?
Well, everybody was talking about the fact that she was in love with me and wanted to meet me, and they were making a big deal of this, and I was just indifferent to it at the time. But when I met her, almost immediately I was struck by how gorgeous she was, and I wasn't particularly good looking. She was introduced to me by a bunch of mutual friends. They were all saying, well, here he is, and sort of like you put tremendous pressure on her. She just turned and almost ran back to her dorm because she was so embarrassed because they made such a big deal of it, but came back very quickly thereafter. We went to dinner together that night, and I fell in love with her almost from the beginning. So
you got married your senior year. She was a freshman and you were a senior.
That's right. We got married 3 months before the end of the school year.
And I love this quote from you, Bill. It says, I was so glad when football season ended because you had to be mean and vicious to be your best in football, and you were too in love to be mean and vicious.
Yes. The other players would say, I was so much in love I had ants, sugar ants crawling up my legs because I was so in love with her. And we, of course, were extremely happy from the very beginning.
Bill graduated from Baylor and played football professionally in Canada for 1 year. He then went on to have a very successful career in the NFL for 11 years, playing first for the Detroit Lions and then the Cleveland Browns. During this time, he and Mavis had 3 children. Bill attended seminary school in the off-season for a degree in theology, but he wasn't the only one taking classes.
I went back to seminary and got my Master's of Divinity from Southwestern. Went back 6 off seasons for that purpose. It's only a 3-year course of study, but I had to go back 6 years because I was just going in the off season. And Mavis would go to seminary as well, and the professors were bragging about how good a student she was, and they were saying, you know, she's a better student than you are.
That is wonderful. I love the way that you said that you were determined to be great in football so you could reach more people.
Exactly.
And you went on, as I said, you won the NFL championship in 1964. And you, because of this accomplishment, you got to meet somebody very special.
Yeah. Billy Graham was in Denver in a citywide time. And I was the prominent football player, Christian football player. And so he invited me to come and do a testimony in his Denver crusade. And I did that, and we became great friends, Billy and I.
A Christian isn't one who withdraws from life, but rather one who infiltrates. And it is up to us, every one of us who are Christians, to live in our particular profession, in our particular world, as Christians where we are. We must not be moral policemen that go around spanking people's hands for their bad moral conduct, but rather we must be representatives, ambassadors for Jesus Christ.
So Billy Graham, really, would you say that he influenced you into beginning Bill Glass Ministries?
Right.
You ended your NFL career in 1968.
Yeah.
And then in 1969 is when Bill Glass Ministries begins?
Yes, that's right. Actually, we were doing prisons and citywides at the same time because Billy wanted me to do the citywides so I could follow in his footsteps. And I went on and did the citywides, and then gradually changed into doing prisons and citywides together.
It's so fascinating to me, the transition from going to the citywide ministries in 69, and then in 1972, things start to change. Can you tell us how that started?
Well, Pete was a running back for the Browns years before I was, but Pete invited me to come and speak in the prisons.
And now Pete Perini, he's a former Cleveland Brown and warden at Marion Correctional Institute.
Which is the first prison we ever did.
Okay.
And so I came in and spoke at that prison where Pete Perini was the warden, and almost immediately it became well known that I was in prison, that I'd gone to the prisons, and that they had worked, it worked so well in that first prison in Marion that everybody wanted me to come, and I had a full schedule.
When Bill and his team had their first meeting with the warden, Bill insisted that all the inmates be allowed in the prison yard for their presentation. But the prison security team was worried that putting everyone together could cause a riot. Bill explained that his plan was to bring in a semi-trailer to use as a platform for a stage and fill it with such great entertainment that nobody would even think of fighting. And that is exactly what happened. Bill brought the world's strongest man, the world yo-yo champion, and McCoy McLemore of the Milwaukee Bucks, just to name a few. The inmates loved every minute of it. There wasn't a single fight, and the event was a huge success. After that, Bill's prison ministry started growing so fast that someone said it was like trying to get a drink of water out of a blasting fire hose.
Roger Staubach was one of our early platform guests, along with Tom Landry. Landry was the greatest coach of that time, and Staubach was the greatest player. So I had the best quarterback and the best player and the best coach in pro sports with me, and so I got off to a great start because of that. And then we would invite the inmates in, and the inmates would come because they wanted to see the athletes and different platform guests.
So after that first ministry, the first prison ministry in Marion, you had a huge success.
Right.
You discovered that the inmates were more responsive to the gospel than any other faction of society.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Well, I think that the reason for that is quite simple. People that are hurting are anxious to have their hurts filled. And inmates of prison all are hurting. So they needed help. So we found the best audience possible because they were hurting. And if you're going to have a fishing pond, you need to have a fishing pond made of people that are hungry, that need feeding, and that are anxious to have their needs filled. And so we did that from the very beginning.
Bill Glass's prison ministry behind the walls started out with just 16 volunteers, and now 50 years later, that number has grown to well over 50,000 men and women. The first event that I participated in was at a juvenile facility. The guards escorted all the young residents into the gym where a high wire was set up, and the guest speaker was none other than one of the Flying Walindas, and he gave an inspirational talk to the kids during his amazing performance on the high wire. Afterwards, the kids were put in small groups with a ministry volunteer, and we were able to share the gospel with them. I learned that different facilities had different protocols because the next facility that I visited had a large room filled with inmates. The guards would escort all the volunteers into a room, and the guest speaker would talk. And then the inmates were put in small groups of 5 or 6 with a behind-the-walls volunteer. This was when I had the opportunity to really connect one-on-one with these individuals, listen to their stories, and share the irrepressible love of Jesus with them. Each one of these women was hurting, needing to talk, needing someone to hear them, and needing the love and forgiveness that can only be felt through a personal relationship with Jesus. It was such a precious time, and I felt so honored to be able to be a part of something like this. I've also been where the women were in small individual cells and gone from cell to cell talking through this little opening in the door, always asking permission before I started a conversation, and rarely has anyone ever said they didn't want to talk. Regardless of the circumstances, I have always left a prison event with a heart that is twice as big as when I first arrived. And over that 50 years, you've also had over 1 million inmates surrender their lives to Jesus.
Exactly. It's quite interdenominational and quite interracial, and it's nationally done. In fact, we've been to almost every prison in this country.
Let's put it in a nutshell. You had this incredible 12-year NFL career, and we need to note that the average career in the NFL is about 3.5 years.
That's right.
And during that time, you were never injured.
Right.
You have a beautiful family, 3 beautiful children, the love of your life. You have 60 years of marriage with Mavis.
That's right.
And I don't think it could get any better than that. This powerful ministry. But then on July the 9th of 2017, everything changed for you. It was painfully and permanently disrupted.
Was yelled at by my daughter, who said, "Come here, because something's wrong with Mavis." And I ran down to the little pond beside our house, and I discovered her on the ground there, and it was cold, and she was unconscious, and I tried to shake her back into consciousness, and but when I grabbed her leg, it was cold, so I knew she'd been dead for a while, and I was totally ripped apart. It was like dragging barbed wire through my innermost being, through my nasal cavities, and any way you could describe it, it would not be negative enough to describe it, really. And I thought I would die.
Well, you wrote a book to document your extremely difficult grieving process, the book From Hero to Zero.
Right.
Now, you said that all I could see at first were dark clouds of loneliness. And rather than thanking God for a beautiful 60-year marriage, you felt like you were pouting. But
Right.
I don't think any of us really ever know how we're going to act until we get in a situation. And I don't
That's
think
true.
anything could have prepared you for a loss of that magnitude.
Nothing could have. I was just fortunate to have some things that I couldn't get out of. My ministry was so big and so important and so powerful that there was no way I could let my teammates nor my convict friends down. I couldn't have the luxury of feeling sorry for myself, nor the luxury of just moping. I had to be the leader of the prison ministry and continue to encourage and foster, the salvation of souls in prisons.
Well, when you say that you didn't have the luxury, I want to camp there for just a minute, because I'm thinking that you didn't give yourself permission to do that, because somebody else could have just said, no, I'm grieving, I'm hurting, and given up. But you made a choice not to do that. You made a choice to keep going.
That's right. Well, it was either that or die.
Mm-hmm.
That was the only choice. It was not as if I came to a crossroads. It was as if I had no choice. I had to shape up or ship out. But I felt like dying. I wanted to crawl into a corner and die, but the Lord wouldn't let me do that.
Bill, what would you say were the hardest parts for you about losing Mavis?
I don't know. It was so traumatic that I can't describe how traumatic it was.
I think there's some things that you just don't have words for.
No, you don't. We had such a good marriage, such a great marriage, and now she's gone, and it was so sudden. When I grabbed her leg and it was cold and stiff, and I knew she was dead, I thought I would die myself.
In your book, you talk about the process of reliving and replacing. And you said this was actually something that you used as a strategy to be more successful in football, where you relive your successes and you take those images of your successes and replace the images of your failures and your fears and your heartbreaks. Is
That's
that
right.
something that you used in the grieving process?
It is. I found that I could do that in sports as well as in life. So I either had to, I either had to get right with God and with my fellow man and keep leading the ministry or die. I had no choices.
Well, and regarding my faith walk, it overwhelms me sometimes about how personal my relationship with Jesus is. He's not some aloof God. He's there walking through my pain with me,
Right.
just as he is with everyone. And I think when we direct our focus toward him and allow him to access to our lives as we go through this pain, that along the way there's wisdom and there's lessons that he gives us and that he teaches us. Actually, I would call them gifts that he gives us that we wouldn't have been in the position to receive had we not experienced the painful event.
There's no doubt about it. I am blessed of God to have this terrific ministry. But on the other hand, I don't feel I deserve any credit because like I just sort of fumbled through.
But I think that if kind of fumbling through is the best that we can do,
Yeah.
I think that's all that God asks of us.
That is exactly right. And that's a turning point right there for me.
I know that the scripture in Romans 8:28, and we know that God works all things together for good to those who love him, was a scripture that you relied a lot upon during
Absolutely.
your grieving
Romans
process.
8:28.
And it says we know that God works all things together for good. And you said that when you were going through the grieving process, that you were having a little trouble believing the word all.
Well, I think that you have to, at times, use the word all by faith, because you don't feel like all things are working together for good, but they very well may be working together for good. Even that which is most horrible can work together for good. The most horrible day of my life was when I grabbed Mavis's cold leg and pulled it up in death. But it turned out to be a great turning point, and I grew thereby. I didn't like it. I didn't want it. I hated it. But it turned out to be a great day because I went on with my life, and God blessed. And
I love the point that you made that a lot of times we can believe that word all by our faith. It's not something we can understand or that we can see. But if we're going to have faith, that's when it really counts.
That's what,
is when we can't see what's in front of us.
Exactly.
When it doesn't make sense.
That's when faith really is faith. Otherwise, it's just sight. So if I can see it, it's not really faith. It's sight. So what I need is faith, because I don't really see how God could work all things together for good, but He does. He just continuously surprises me by saying how it works together for good, because it doesn't certainly logically work together for good. You just have to say, by faith I believe that it works together for good.
I would also say that when we recognize God's work in our pain, that our pain is never wasted.
Well, I don't know, sometimes it's just crappy, I mean, you have to say.
Oh, it's really crappy.
That's
but,
right.
I don't think that that's in vain.
No.
I mean, there's a work that He's going to do through that crappiness.
Exactly.
And sometimes you have to go through that in order for Him to do what He's going to do.
Amen.
I think when we trust Him and we hang on to Him through the hardest parts of our lives, the deepest sorrows, the saddest seasons, that's when our faith really grows, and that's when it becomes valid.
That's true.
So I think the valley time, as much as we want to avoid it and we hate it, is, for me, I can say this, it has been some of the most purposeful time of my life.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was able to learn things that I would have never learned otherwise, and do things that I would have never done. I wouldn't do what I'm doing right now if I hadn't have gone through a very dark time in my life.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like God's putting me in a position where maybe I can help somebody or encourage somebody.
That's right.
What advice would you give someone who's really hurting, going through a hard time, who's possibly lost a loved one?
Hang on to Romans 8:28. I know that all things work together for good. Even the worst turns out to be the best. The crucifixion of Jesus is the worst thing that ever happened in the history of this planet. But it turned out to be the best thing, because through His crucifixion, we have a resurrection. That resurrection turns out to be the best thing that ever happened. But I have to know it at times by painful faith, because I don't really see it. But the fact that you don't see it doesn't mean it's any less real.
Bill Glass spent most of his professional and personal life on a metaphorical mountaintop that included a highly successful NFL career, a beautiful and loving wife and family, founding Bill Glass Ministries in 1969, as well as Behind the Walls in 1972, which is still going strong today. But after the death of his beloved wife of 60 years, Bill found himself in a deep, dark valley. He always loved Romans 8:28 that says, all things work together for good to those who love God. But now Bill is believing it through faith, not sight. He's living out Hebrews 11:1 that tells us, faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. Psalm 23 talks about the dark valley that we will all encounter during our lives, and verse 4 gives us 2 promises of hope we can cling to during painful times. First, God says that He will be on the journey with us and comfort us. And second, we will walk through the valley. As difficult as the distressing times of our lives are, we will pass through them. They are not our permanent address. Thank you for joining me in another episode of Christians in Crisis. Please be sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel so we can bring you more stories in the future.